Welcome to Modern Conservatives. I'm your host, Hugo Gurdon, editorial director of the Washington Examiner. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Thomas Sowell, who's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and one of the renowned conservative economists in the country. Professor Sowell, thanks so much for joining me on Modern Conservatives. And I want to congratulate you first on your book, Discrimination and Disparities, which is a fascinating read, which I completed over the weekend. I want to go straight to that. I want to go straight to that. If I understand it rightly, the thesis of the book is contained in the title, which is that discrimination and disparities are two distinct things, and that there is what you call an invincible fallacy that seems to guide debate in politics and policy discussions, which suggests that any difference in outcome between different groups, whether they be races or the sexes or nations, must be to do with either discrimination or genetic deficiencies. And the argument that you make is that all the evidence suggests this is absolutely wrong. So first of all, correct me if I'm wrong on the thesis of the book, and then tell us about the book and the thesis that you have laid out here.
You're absolutely right. It's amazing. Whenever you look for facts, when you do research, or either about people or about nature, you find skewed distributions everywhere. But when you listen to people talk, especially in the academic world, the underlying assumption is that the people are all have the same capability, and that therefore any differences in their outcomes must be to other people in some way doing them wrong. It's amazing because if you think just of an individual, I mean, the same man does not have the same capability. He's not even equal to himself at different stages of life, much less being equal to all the other people at all their highly varying stages of their lives.
And one of the things that you point out, and you mentioned age just now, is that there are some sections of the population, perhaps a section divided, sorted by race, where the median age is radically different from that of another group. And so you would expect those with the median age of 40 to be earning far more, for example, than those with the median age of 25. And yet when there is a distinction between those two, people suggest that it has to do with some kind of discrimination, unfair discrimination, and that it therefore takes government action to remediate it.
Absolutely, and the differences range even larger than that. Japanese Americans have a median age of 50. Hispanic Americans have a median age of 26. There's no way they could be equally divided on activities that either require the strength and energy of youth, such as playing Major League Baseball, or things that require long years of experience and education, such as being a surgeon or a CEO.
Right. So why does the invincible fallacy persist? Why is it invincible? Who's to blame?
Well, I think it's invincible mainly because people want to believe it and therefore do not look for any evidence that might go the other way. And people who report evidence that points the other way are simply demonized rather than answered. Right.
And in fact, some of them are barracked and abused and prevented from speaking when they're invited to college campuses.
Oh, absolutely.
So you have a very strong emphasis on empirical evidence. And when I was reading the book, and when I've listened to you talking before and reading some of your other books, that seems to be a consistent theme of yours. Let's look at the evidence. Let's see whether these policies are testable hypotheses. And it reminded me very much, actually, of something that Margaret Thatcher said, which was, she was a conservative because the facts of life are conservative. Is it the evidence that you've been studying over the decades that has led you to become a conservative? Are you a conservative because the evidence suggests conservative prescriptions are true?
Yes, heavens, I was a Marxist in my 20s. And I was a Marxist even after taking Milton Friedman's course at the University of Chicago. It's only when I got into the government and I began doing research there that I realized that none of these beliefs would hold up once you start collecting hard facts. And over the years, as more and more hard facts turned up, then more and more of things that I believed before turned out to be unsustainable.
Right. There's a parallel question, and I'm just going to look at my note here, because on the back of your book, the Discrimination and Disparities, Paul Johnson describes you as the most interesting and original philosopher at work in America. Now, first of all, I mean, do you think of yourself as a philosopher? And if the evidence and the facts made you conservative, was it economics that made you a philosopher?
Well, I'm not sure. Other people will assign all kinds of names to me. Some of them are much worse than philosopher. But no, I really don't spend a lot of time trying to classify myself. Too many other people who are doing that, and they can perhaps do it better.
Okay, well, we'll leave it to them. One of the things that we at the Washington Examiner have recently been looking at is whether or not the party of the left, the Democrats, take their voters for granted. And just to give an example, when they had the strong majorities that they had in 2009 in Congress, they had the presidency, they had the House, and they had the Senate. They had been talking about fixing immigration, but when they had the majorities and the ability to do so, they didn't fix it. And instead, what they did was not fix it and run on fixing it after the next election. They did that in the 2010 election, and then President Obama did it again in the 2012 election. And I was very struck reading your book that you said that there is a kind of incentive for politicians not to fix problems. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think some of them may be aiming to fix them, but if they don't have all the facts available to them, and if they're determined to have a preconceived notion, the chances of their fixing it are very remote. And so you have a sort of serial solutions, I call them, that you solve one problem by creating a bigger problem, which then catches up with you, and you solve that some other way. We have that in California, where back in the 1970s, we started restricting the building of housing along the coast and down the San Francisco Peninsula. And it comes as an enormous surprise to people that the housing prices here have just skyrocketed. Now, right. As of 1970, housing prices in California were just what they were in the rest of the country. Today, it's something like 3 times the size of, there are shacks that are selling, for what mansions are selling for in some other places.
One of the things that, to stay on the same point, I think that the point that you made was that if a politician or a party which is in power fixes a problem that drew a lot of voters to them, then that constituency goes away. If they fix the problem, they lose the people who want them to fix the problem, which is perhaps very cynical on their part. But is that the way politicians, you think, operate? That they would rather actually keep the problem to go into elections and to campaign on than to actually get them done?
Not necessarily. I think, for example, of the EEOC, which is set up to fight against discrimination. When they've succeeded to some extent, or rather when the conditions are such that there's less discrimination for all kinds of reasons, they then have to create a bigger problem. They have to have another definition of discrimination, so that now people who, for example, do background checks on all job applicants to see if they have a criminal record. The EEOC has sued companies for doing that because they said that has a disparate impact on low-income minorities.
Right.
And so when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, no one thought that doing background checks was discrimination, but they must always expand whatever evil there is. If the evil is in fact fading away, they must nevertheless come up with new definitions that will preserve the word.
Well, amazingly, and I had actually not realized this, but you mentioned it in the book, that the Supreme Court actually enshrined disparate impact as a basis for presuming that there has been some form of unconstitutional discrimination.
Oh, absolutely. And it's huge mischief here, which harms not only employers, but employees as well, including minority employees. the ease with which you can file a lawsuit that will cost millions of dollars to defend legally and drag on for a decade or more means that there's every incentive now for employers to avoid hiring people in the category that the government can use to start such lawsuits. You don't even need to have a single human being claim to be discriminated against for those lawsuits to go forward. If the numbers don't match the preconceptions, then by definition, there's discrimination as far as they're concerned.
Right. Do you think that there have been a number of polls that suggest a certain increase in the support that President Trump is getting from obviously a very, very low base amongst black voters, and particularly young black voters? Do you think that there's any signs, or do you think that there may come a point, whether it's soon or perhaps later, where racial minorities, in particular black people, are less sort of lockstep aligned with the party of the left, and that they realize that their position is not improving by their support for the Democrats?
It's possible. Much depends upon how well the Republicans articulate. And articulation has never been one of the skills of the Republicans, with a few exceptions like Ronald Reagan or Abraham Lincoln. But in between, not a lot.
Right. They're not very good at making the point that they might easily be regarded as the party of the have-nots rather than the party of the haves, which is the way that they are portrayed. It's always seemed to me one of the ironies, and I think you get to this in your book as well, that where the government and the unions have stepped in to try and improve the incomes of people down at the bottom of the ladder, or to raise wages, there's higher unemployment. And I remember when I was reporting on Wall Street in the late 1980s, it was suggested that 5% unemployment was basically maximum employment. Well, we're at 3.9% in the United States now, and you point out that in Hong Kong, unemployment is 2%. So there are policies which are said to help people at the bottom, but actually throw more of them out of work.
Well, yes, one of the worst of those are the minimum wage laws. And it's painful because I've been following that for decades. And uniformly, the increase of minimum wages, the minimum wage rate, has led to people losing their jobs. If you go back as far as 1948, I guess that's what, 70 years ago, the black unemployment rate was under 10% among teenagers. So was the white rate and the difference between the two groups was virtually nil. And as you increase the minimum wage, both sets of teenagers now see some multiple levels of unemployment, and now a huge racial gap opens up between them. It's what you would expect by the most elementary application of economics, but apparently no one is interested in those facts.
Right. One of the things that comes through in your writing is that you do not have a lot of sympathy for self-pity, and one of the ways that you put it, I think, was that people used to count their blessings, whereas now they count their unfulfilled wishes. Can you talk a little bit about the change in that change and the way that society has changed to that extent?
This is partly a result of education and of the media. Blessings do not get votes. Unfulfilled wishes do. So it's understandable that politicians have to manufacture grievances. I'm always amazed at the lengths to which people will go to create grievances. The most insignificant things. Some years ago, there was a lot of grievances on the left because of the way the map of the world was presented, because it distorted the way the sizes of Europe and tropical countries. Well, there's no way in the world you can have an accurate map of a globe on a two-dimensional map. And so you only have a choice of what are you going to distort. And for some particular purposes, you will want to distort the directions, and for other reasons, you want to keep the areas comparable.
Right, right. It's sort of that idea of equality, and that only discrimination can produce differences of outcome stokes the feeling of entitlement and dependency, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. That plays into your observation that there are lots of people who love to tell others how to live their lives. And that seems to be, I mean, that's behind the idea of the so-called nanny state. How much damage is that doing? I've seen you suggest that it's done a great deal more damage, for example, than the legacy of slavery.
Yes, because if you look at the things that have happened since the 1960s, where this idea of the government looking after everybody took hold, you find, for example, that the number of black children who grew up without a father was about 1/3 of black children. 2/3 of black children were raised in two-parent families. Now, this is 100 years practically after slavery, but after 35 years of the welfare state, that was driven to the point where now 2/3 of the black kids were being raised without a father present, and among blacks in poverty, 85%. So that we can, if we just look at the timelines, we can see where this originated, and it originated in the 20th century with the triumph of the welfare state. Moreover, the same thing has happened in Britain and in other places where the underclass is primarily white. The results are virtually identical.
Is there a moral element to this? I mean, in that if you emphasize equality and you suggest that there should be no disparity of outcome, does it raise what used to be regarded as a sin, I suppose, that is envy, into a sort of ideal? It says envy isn't wrong, it actually is a justified anger against an improper outcome.
Yes, and I think that's been concentrated for a very long time among the intelligentsia, far more so than among the public at large. That the public at large is interested, for example, if infant mortality rate is cut in half, I don't think a mother who realizes that her child has twice the chance of living is worried about the fact that some billionaire's child has 2.5 times as much chance of living.
Right, right. You noticed in you made mention in your farewell column, there have been great material advances, but there have also been many social retrogressions. There have been gains. People are infinitely, or not infinitely, but very substantially richer and can enjoy material goods which even the rich in past generations could not afford and were just not available. Does that, I'd be interested to know whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. You see things, some things improving and some things getting worse. Where do you fit on that sort of optimistic, pessimistic scale?
I suppose in terms of material things, I'm optimistic. You're quite right. I remember a relative of mine who worked for a rich family once took me to work with him. And in this person's living room was this console with this little tiny screen where there was the first television, which cost an enormous amount of money. It was certainly not as large as a postcard, and it must have cost thousands. And today, people on welfare wouldn't have something like that, right, because material things have just gotten better. Among people's behavior, that unfortunately I think has gotten worse and progressively so over the years. And again, primarily the turning point was the 1960s.
Right, right. So talk a little bit, if you would, about, there are two very distinct types of discrimination. Your book starts with a sort of discrimination 1 and discrimination 2. And in particular, you say that the first kind of discrimination can be divided into 1A and 1B, and that 1B is often mistaken for discrimination 2. Now that all sounds terribly complicated, but I'm going to let you explain what it means and the way it affects our politics.
Well, discrimination, you know, when we say someone has discriminating tastes, we mean that this is someone who is very good at discerning differences and making the right choices accordingly. But that's very different from the kind of discrimination that's led to anti-discrimination laws, where the fact that a person is black or is a woman or whatever then determines how that person is treated. And it is easy to confuse the two, and there are politicians who have every vested interest in promoting that confusion. Because for one thing, different people have different interests, different backgrounds, and so forth, and so they will almost inevitably have different outcomes. And trying to decide which kind of discrimination there is a tough one. Let me give an example. Mm-hmm. The one about the job applicants who get criminal background checks. Right. In point of fact, the employers who do that tend to hire more young black males than the employers who do not, because the ones who don't have the criminal background checks, they see a young black male and they know that they're taking a chance then hiring him than hiring someone else because of the higher incidence of criminal activity. But if the employer has a business that requires him to check everybody, then he knows that this guy either does or doesn't have a criminal background, and therefore he hires more young blacks.
Right.
But again, the reality doesn't seem to affect the politicians in the slightest, or the intellectuals.
On the question of race, something that comes through at the end of your book is not quite explicitly said, but I think it's there, and that is that you oppose reparations to black people living today for slavery, and you say that the past cannot be changed, but we can change the present and the future, and that there is no real moral content in punishing people, one set of people now who weren't born when the sins were committed against another group for whom the reparations would be paid. You talk a little bit about, am I right in saying that that's your view? And
yes, and I think more fundamentally, it doesn't come across in the history that they're taught, but slavery was one of the longest living and most universal of all human institutions. Now that says something about human nature. So if you had reparations for slavery, virtually everybody on the planet would have had an ancestor somewhere who was enslaved. The number of whites who were enslaved in North Africa was larger than the number of blacks who were enslaved in the United States. No one is trying to get them reparations because the people in North Africa aren't about to pay it.
Right, and those were Europeans who were
yes.
captured and by the pirates and sold into the Ottoman Empire, I think.
Well, that was one source to think. I was thinking of the Barbary pirates on the other side of the Mediterranean.
Right.
But all around the Mediterranean, there were hundreds of towers built on the coastline so that people could be warned when the pirates approached so they wouldn't be captured and taken away in slavery. There were over 100 towers around Sicily alone.
Yeah. Professor Sowell, as a final question, I want to switch from the subject of slavery to the subject of freedom. If I could think that one value comes through more in your books than any other is the value that you place on individual freedom and the freedom of individuals to sort themselves as they choose rather than having the government sort them, because the government and other large institutions are not as flexible or adaptable or as nuanced, and they can therefore not do it as well as free people can do it for themselves. Is that an accurate description of your feeling?
It is, quite even aside from the feeling of being free, which people have risked their lives for that. But by the nature of the case, the government can't possibly know as much about what you want as you know. There's an old saying that says, a fool can put on his coat better than a wise man can put it on for him.
Right.
And I think that applies to a lot of things.
Well, Professor Sowell, I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.